Today we're going to cover impersonal verbs. There's really nothing very exciting about impersonal verbs. It's more just that there is a lot of information for us to look at because Latin really likes impersonal verbs. And so this is really a lesson more about vocabulary than anything else. But let's get started and see what impersonal verbs are and how they work in Latin. So an impersonal verb is a verb that really begins with it. And we do this a fair amount in English as well, right? There are certain expressions where the subject is always it. And often these are events in the weather. It's snowing, it's raining, it's thundering. There's no subject for a verb like thunder other than it for the most part, or snow. Nothing snows other than it. So these kinds of expressions where we use it are called impersonal because there's no person, there's no subject, it's this abstract it. And we do things in other kinds of expressions where we say, it's a pleasure to meet you, it pains me to say it, it happens to be the case, it matters to you but not to me. Any of those expressions where we start off with it, those are impersonal expressions where we're not referring to a specific thing, we're just referring to a general situation. And Latin, like English, has a lot of these kinds of expressions. And the tricky thing is that they don't all function in the same way. And so that's why we need to look at them to make sure that you understand the different possibilities. Obviously, there are lots and lots of these verbs and they don't all work the same. And so I'm not going to quiz you to make sure you know which ones take the genitive and which ones take the accusative. But I do expect you to be familiar enough with them so that you can translate them accurately. The easiest ones to understand are whether, because they work very much like they work in English, and they are expressed impersonally, and you're not going to see a direct object or anything like that with these. They're really straightforward. And so we have words like fulgurat, there is lightning, lucescit, it's getting light, it's growing to be dawn, pluit, it's raining, tonat, it's thundering, vesperascit, it's growing dark, or we could say, right, twilight's coming or something like that. For all these verbs that we'll be looking at, I'm for the most part working in the present tense, but that doesn't mean that you can't see these verbs in the past or in the future, right? And your book gives you the conjugation that these verbs belong to so that you'll be able to see what they would look like in the imperfect, for example, or in the future, right? But you can see that this verb is first conjugation, and so I could say something like fulgurabat, right? There was lightning yesterday over a long period of time, but often these are expressions that we use in the present. But just so you know, they can occur in any tense, but they will always be third person singular because our subject is always it. And this is true for all of the verbs we'll be looking at today. Some verbs that have this impersonal construction are verbs that really deal with feelings. And there are a bunch of them, as you can see, that take an accusative of the person who is feeling and a genitive or an infinitive of the thing that causes the feeling. These are verbs like miseret, it causes pity, right? This is related to the adjective miser, which means wretched, or miseror, to pity. Painetet, it causes regret, it makes you sorry. Piget, it causes vexation. Pudet, it causes shame. Tidet, it causes tedium, it bothers. And so you can see from these examples that I'm giving you that the person, whoever is feeling the pity or the regret or the vexation or whatever, that person is in the accusative. So here's our person in the accusative. And then that thing that is causing them to feel this emotion is either in an infinitive or it's in the genitive. So, for example, in the first example, discere historia me valde taidet. Learning history really, this is really, bores me, really is a cause of tedium for me. Okay, so that's how that works. Discere historia me valde taidet. Or you could say, instead of using an infinitive, you could use a genitive. Me stultitiae me painetet. I am sorry about my foolishness. My foolishness is a cause of regret for me. Okay? So you can see, you can translate these very literally if you want to. But in English, of course, we would switch things around, often either using that thing that's the accusative or the infinitive as a subject, or starting off with the person, right? Me painetet, I'm sorry, right? Me tidet, I'm bored. Me piget, I'm bothered, I'm troubled, right? Something like that. So you can think about ways to translate these in ways that sound more like English and less like crazy impersonal constructions. There's some verbs that really like to take an accusative and an infinitive, and these verbs are really the accusative of person and the infinitive of the thing. There's no possibility to take a genitive. And these kinds of constructions are really like an indirect statement, as you can see. So these are not really so much about feelings like I'm sorry, I'm bored, I'm regretful, I'm ashamed. They're really about a sort of more abstract idea, sometimes has sort of a moral quality. So you can see here we have verbs like decet, which means it suits or it's fitting. Dedecet, you can see the de here means that it's the opposite of decet. It disgraces, it's absolutely unfitting. Delectat, it pleases. Juvat, it pleases. And here I've given you an example. Decet te Romam venire. So literally, it is fitting, right? And here, feels just like an indirect statement, right? It's fitting that you come to Rome, right? But you could say it's fitting for you to come to Rome. And that is totally okay too, right? We want this to sound like English when we translate. But I think that in some ways, this type that takes the accusative infinitive is just really easy because it really feels like what you've got is just an indirect statement. And so if you translate it that way, that's totally fine. We also have some verbs that function in a very similar way, but instead of taking the accusative, they take the dative. Verbs like this are verbs like displicate, which means it's displeasing. Its opposite is down here, placet. It is pleasing, right? You can see that all that's happened is you've got this prefix de, and then the plac becomes plic. Libet, it is pleasant. Licet, it is allowed or it is permitted. Prodest, which is from prosum, to be useful, it is useful or it is beneficial. So again, the thing that is pleasing or unpleasing or allowed or beneficial is in the infinitive, and the thing that is the person that is pleasing to or displeasing to, right, is in the dative. So I've given you a couple of examples. Legere latinam mihi placet. So here's our person, and the thing that is pleasing is in the accusative. So I could say legere latinam, reading Latin, is pleasing mihi, to me. You could also switch this around and say, I like reading Latin. I like to read Latin. And displicate would be the opposite. Mihi displicet legere Latinum. I don't like to read Latin. Reading Latin is displeasing to me. So however you want to render it, if you want to render these very literally, that's fine. If you want to find a more elegant way to translate them, that is fine too. And you can see I've given you another example again. The person is in the dative, and the thing that is, pleasing, displeasing, allowed is in the infinitive. So tibi liquid canem lavare. It was permitted for you, for you to wash the dog. You were allowed to wash the dog. So in these situations, you can see you can mix them up. These are less like indirect statements, unlike the ones in the previous slide, but I think they're pretty clear, and that dative I think is very helpful because it gives you a sense of that to or for someone makes it pretty clear what's going on. Now, there are some verbs you already know, or verbs that maybe look very similar or built from verbs you already know. And of course, there are a few here that you don't, that are new, that mean it happens, right? So, for example, our verb fio, which means to become, can also mean to happen. And verbs like this can also have an impersonal usage in the third person singular, where it will mean it happens. The important thing about this category of verbs is that it's going to be followed by a result clause. It happens that. The result clause, just like any other result clause, is going to follow sequence of tenses. So if we're in primary sequence, the verb in the ut clause will be in a present subjunctive. In secondary sequence, the verb in the ut clause will be in the imperfect subjunctive. And I think these, again, are pretty straightforward. The most important thing is knowing what these verbs mean. Most of them mean it happens. So accusative, it happens, or it turns out that. It happens that. Contigit means it happens. Ewenit, you can see it comes from wenio a, it comes out of, that is, it turns out or it happens. Fit, it happens. And then we have a few here that are slightly different, but they have this same sense, right? Sequitur, it follows, that is, it happens after, it follows from something that. Restat, it remains that, right? From sto stare, to stay, to stand again, to remain. Efficitur, from facio, to come about. So it is brought about in the passive. So you can see that all of these are going to have this ut clause after the verb, and really you're just going to see this verb by itself and then your ut clause. So accidit ut Caesar bene ducat. It happens that Caesar leads well. That's the result, right? It happens that. Or restabat ut matrem iuarem. It remained for me to help my mother. It remained that I help my mother. Okay, So just know that these verbs are going to take a result clause. It's like any other result clause. And if you translate, it happens that, it remains that, it follows that, you're good to go. We also have a couple of expressions that mean it is necessary, or something that's very close to it is necessary. The two most common are necesse est and opus est. And these take either a dative plus, it should say infinitive, or it takes a clause often introduced by ut, although sometimes the ut is gone. And again, it follows sequence of tenses. So if we're in primary sequence, we'll see a present subjunctive, and if we're in past sequence, secondary sequence, we'll see an imperfect subjunctive. And these don't tend to have like that full sequence, just like purpose and result clauses. We also have this verb apportet, which means it is proper. And sometimes apportet verges on meaning it is necessary. We'll see if you see any examples of that in your sentences. But it takes an accusative infinitive or a clause, again, like this clause. Either ut, or sometimes not having the ut, but then a verb in the subjunctive. Okay, so here I've given you a couple of examples for you to look at. Mihi necesse est ire. So you can see necesse est is the kind that takes a dative plus the infinitive. These are like those ones that we just looked at, like decet and licet, right? It is permitted for me. It is pleasing for me, placet, right? Necesse est mihi ire. It is necessary for me to go, infinitive. Okay. But we could do the same kind of thing with an ut clause. So apportet tibi ut me audias, right? It is proper for you, Tibi, to listen to me. It is proper that you listen to me. Okay? This is really a sort of stylistic choice. Often you will see that infinitive, but that doesn't mean you always will see it. And so you have to be prepared that you may see something like ut me audias. But again, I don't think this will be terribly troubling for you, right? It is proper for you that you listen to me. Okay. One final wrinkle, okay. Opus est Caesari. Okay, there's our dative of, so it is necessary for Kaiser, for Caesar. And then we have here an ablative. Sometimes this is only with opus est. Only. You get an ablative of the thing that you need. So in this case, Caesar needs troops. It is necessary for Caesar of troops. There is need for Caesar of troops. Caesari opus est copiis. Okay, only with opus est. Again, I don't think these are so tricky. We've seen already examples of impersonal verbs that take a dative plus an infinitive or an accusative plus an infinitive. The tricky thing, I suppose, is that these three constructions can also take an ut clause, but it's really not difficult to translate, as you can see, if you run into it. And we're getting close to being done. We have these two words, interest and refert. These mean something like it concerns or it is in the interest of. I often like to translate this as it matters, which is not a translation that your book gives you, but I think you can see when we look at it that this is maybe a more colloquial way of expressing this. These two constructions like to take either an infinitive or an ut clause. So in that way, they are not so different from necesse est or opus est or a portet, right? You have that flexibility. The thing is that instead of taking a dative or accusative, they take, right, interest will take a genitive of person, or it will take an ablative of the feminine pronominal adjective. And in fact, Refert only really will take an ablative feminine of the pronominal adjective. So that means it will take, instead of mihi, it would be me a, tu a, nostra, etc. Okay? Vestra. Let me show you how this works. Okay, so for example, we can have with interest, here's our genitive, okay, omnium. So it is in the interest of all that, and here we have an ut clause, that Caesar conquer, that Caesar win. It's in everyone's interest that Caesar win. Interest omnium ut Caesar vincat. We could also have that pronominal adjective instead, and this especially is true with refert. Mea refert lupos interficere. So here we have an infinitive instead of an ut clause, but we could have an ut clause. But mea refert, it concerns me that, and then what concerns me, interficere lupos, killing wolves. Killing wolves is a concern to me. Killing wolves matters to me, we might say. As above, it's in everyone's interest that Caesar win. Caesar's winning matters to everyone, right? That would be another way we could translate it. Here, we don't often get negative clauses. If we do, they take nay. And I just wanted to show you that in case you should run into one in your sentences. But ciceronis interest, so here again we have that genitive with interest. And then we have this clause, right? Ciceronis interest, it concerns Cicero, ne Marcus vivat, that Marcus not live. Okay, so it's important is almost the idea to Cicero that Marcus not live. It's in his interest that Marcus not live. Okay, and then you can have these sort of set phrases that are really just responses to people, where you would say something like nihil refert, right? It doesn't matter at all. Or mea refert, I care. It concerns me. Or mea non refert, it doesn't matter to me, right? If somebody asked you, what do you want to have for dinner? Mea non refert. It's like saying, I don't care, right? It's not of interest to me. It doesn't matter to me. It doesn't concern me. So this is it's a phrase, you see it with a fair amount of regularity, and I think of these impersonal constructions, it's the one that's maybe the hardest to translate, because translating it literally just feels really awkward, and translating it in a way that makes sense in English means that you have to move things around in ways where it feels like it's not following rules anymore. So we'll practice a lot with these, because I at least think that these are the ones that are the trickiest. Okay? Oh, and why do we do this? Which you might ask. So this is because of Refert. Re is from race. Race here is, of course, feminine singular of the fifth declension. And so mea re, right? It brings with my affair. It carries with my affair is really what you're saying. And so but then the re becomes part of the verb, and we retain this mea or vuestra. So it's just a kind of odd expression that gets solidified into a new word. Okay, a couple more things. One thing to know, and we've seen this in our readings, though not formally in our book, is this word fore, which is really the future infinitive of the verb sum, to be. It's equivalent to futurum esse, and because, as you can see, it is so much shorter than futurum esse, it is much more common. And so it's a good thing to know that this is just the future active infinitive of the verb to be. But one thing that we often see, and this is true in situations where Latin would be forced otherwise to use a future passive infinitive, that supine plus ire, if you remember. Right, that future passive infinitive, supine plus ire. Latin doesn't like to do it, and so one thing you can do instead is use this phrase fore ut in, say, an indirect statement. So I give you one example. This is not terribly common, so I don't think we should spend a lot of time on it, but your book does talk about it. Poeta scieba fore ut carmen laudaretur. The poet knew that, right? So here's our indirect statement. The poet knew that it would be the case that the poem was praised. Okay? Now we could just say something like the poem knew that the poem was praised and use that, right? It would be just as likely that we could say something like poeta sciebat Carmen laudatum iri. The poet knew that the poem was praised, would be praised, laudatum iri. But because Latin hates to use this, we end up with this fore ut, and then here we can just use the passive of the subjunctive, and Latin likes that a lot better. So I know it's crazy. We would not do this in English. Just be aware that it can happen. And finally, the impersonal passive. This is something that occurs with some regularity. It's not super common, but it's the kind of thing that always trips people up, even really experienced readers of Latin, because it involves transitive verbs, right, or intransitive verbs that, should say intransitive verbs that don't appear in the passive. So there are all kinds of verbs, right, in English, venio, to come. It has no passive form, really. We don't say something was come. And the same with eo, right? We don't typically use it in the passive. But these kinds of verbs in Latin can be used impersonally in a passive way. This also happens with verbs that typically take, say, the dative instead of accusative direct object. These are verbs sometimes where it's hard to make it passive and get all the information in. You can do it impersonally and then it works. So, for example, pugnatum est, it was fought. We would be much more likely to use the active and say something like, they fought, there was a fight. We would use a a noun, right? We would say pugna erat. There was a fight. Not if you're Roman. Pugnatum est. It was fought. But we can translate this, there was a fight. Okay. Likewise, Romam venitum est. It was come to Rome, or there was a coming to Rome. We would never say such a thing. We would say they came to Rome. So depending on who's doing it, what the context is, you can play around with these kinds of impersonal constructions because in English it just sounds ridiculous. Likewise, here, parco is a verb that takes a dative, right? So here's the dative it's taking, and here we're making it in, we're getting the dative direct object in there by using this in the passive, and then we have to use ate. So we would say, it is spared to the women by you. Literally, that's what it says. But we can just say, the women were spared by you. And that, I think, sounds a lot better in English. So this is just a sort of interesting idiomatic phrase, way of doing things in Latin, as many of these are. And it's just something to keep your eye out for, especially if things just don't seem to be working out in your translation. This could be the reason why. So I realize this is a whole lot of information to throw at you, and for the most part, it's kind of a ridiculous amount of information because all we're talking about are impersonal expressions, that is, it blanks. But in Latin, of course, there are lots of different kinds of these, varying kinds of constructions. We have some where you would say something like pluit, it rains, and you're pretty much done. You have other kinds of constructions that like to take a genitive of person, maybe, and an accusative of thing. Some that like to take a dative and infinitive. Some that like to take an accusative and infinitive. Sometimes that accusative infinitive really looks like an indirect statement. And sometimes instead we get an ut clause that takes the subjunctive. In addition to this, we also have these impersonal passive constructions that just seem a little odd. So there are all kinds of different options. The most important thing to do is not to freak out and try to remember what takes what, but try to look at the things that are maybe the trickiest. For me, that's always interest and refert. And then just remember that datives work like datives, accusatives work like accusatives, infinitives work like infinitives. For the most part, these are going to be things that are going to be pretty straightforward for you to translate, provided that you know what that impersonal construction means. So we will definitely practice with a lot of these, but don't get too upset if you are having trouble remembering which takes the dative, which takes the accusative. It will start to feel more natural. Okay, so send me up to 3 questions, and we'll deal with your problems in class.